When you think of places in London that we could talk about for the Crime and Punishment edition, I'm sure this location is one of the first you would think of. It's the Tower of London, relevant to crime and punishment for many different reasons. It was a prison, a torture chamber, and an execution site. So many famous people were executed here, like Anne Boleyn for supposedly being a witch, or Guy Fawkes was tortured here after he tried to blow up the king.
It was built as a symbol of royal power to create fear and intimidate enemies or criminals. The first prisoner here was in 1101, Ranulph Flambard, who was also the first to escape, climbing through a window of the White Tower and using a rope to get down. Through time, the tower held so many different prisoners, royalty, politicians, thieves, and religious conspirators, and by the Tudor era, it was the most important and unbreakable prison in the country. But find out more about the escapes in another video on our page.
One of the royal prisoners here was a young Elizabeth I. Before she was queen, her older sister Mary I put her in the tower because she was scared Elizabeth was plotting to overthrow her. She was held in the same apartments that her mum, Anne Boleyn, was held in before being executed by her dad, Henry VIII. How sad is that? There were quite a few Tudor royals executed here, actually. Turns out the Tudor monarchs punished enemies quite severely.
An important criminal story to do with the tower that you might have heard of is Guy Fawkes. In November 1605, he was discovered under the Houses of Parliament with gunpowder. He was about to blow up King James and Parliament. He was captured and imprisoned here at the Tower of London before him and some of the other conspirators were hanged, drawn and quartered, with their body parts displayed throughout London as a warning to other criminals plotting. It would have been quite common to see dead body parts hanging all over London, and lots of kings liked to chop off the heads of their enemies and display them on spikes.
The last person executed here was Joseph Jacobs in 1941, who was a spy for Germany in World War II.
Great Tower Hill and Little Tower Hill are where executions used to take place. Great Tower Hill was where the rich and famous were executed, and it is now Trinity Square Gardens and a war memorial. The rich and famous would be beheaded because that was seen as the less brutal method of execution, and that happened right here. If you were an awfully terrible criminal, then you'd be hung, drawn and quartered, which is disgusting. And if no one really cared too much about you, then maybe you'd just be hung.
One of the terrible punishments that criminals faced throughout time, as I'm sure you know, was the death penalty. And a lot of executions happened here at Smithfield, now a meat market, and it stinks. The leader of the Peasants' Revolt against Richard II was executed here in 1382, or in the Tudor era, Bloody Mary had over 50 Protestants killed here. So it's quite a spooky location where lots of criminals were put to death in the 13th and 14th centuries. Strangely, during the medieval times, it was quite a fun place where they had jousting and fairs, but it was still most famous for its executions. And the Elms was the place where heretics were executed, like William Wallace in 1305. A lot of the decapitated heads from criminals were taken from here to London Bridge to be put on the gatehouse to scare off other criminals. And interestingly, this area has the oldest building in London, with a lot of the buildings surviving the destruction caused by the Great Fire of London. But sadly, nothing remains of the original execution spot. In the 1400s, this area would have had lots of elm trees, which is why it was called the Elms. And the original gallows of London were here. Then they were moved to Tyburn Street, and then outside Newgate Prison. But by 1598, in a survey of London, the elm trees seem to have completely disappeared.
Newgate Prison was on the corner of Newgate Street and the Old Bailey for over 700 years. It was created between 1770 and 1778, but it was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. By 1783, it was London's main prison, and the city's gallows were also moved here too. But by 1902, it had all been demolished. The name Newgate is interesting within itself. It actually named after one of the gates of the city, which during Henry II's reign, in 1188, many prisoners were held in the Newgate before they went for trial. The word has passed through history as a word meaning despair, because for most people in Newgate, their only way out was execution, and very close to Smithfields where we were earlier. There's lots of grisly tales from the prison, and it was known as the decaying heart of medieval London. During Henry III's reign, conditions had got so bad that when a famine swept through the country, they had to resort to cannibalism to stay alive. Why they wanted to stay alive in a horrible prison, we don't know, but it's quite grim.
Another, slightly less famous prison in London was Marshalsea Prison. It stood for 500 years before being demolished in 1842 and is said to be the second most important prison after the Tower of London. These types of prisons became famous after Charles Dickens, the author, wrote about living in one growing up. It was a special prison because it was a debtor's prison, which meant that people who owed a lot of money went there, and you could get out by either paying back your debt, having a friend pay your debt off for you, or having the person you owed money to saying, "It's okay, you've served your time."
Another famous place for criminals in London was the East End. Specifically Whitechapel, infamous because of one man in particular, Jack the Ripper, although the area did have quite a high crime rate regardless. In the 19th century, Whitechapel was known because of its poverty, unhappiness, and crime, and the majority of people who lived here were very poor and likely unemployed. Lodging houses and slums were overcrowded with people, with houses on Flower and Dean Street becoming known for their poor living conditions. Because of these conditions, criminals were everywhere, and police feared the area.
In 1829, the Metropolitan Police Force was set up, and by the time of the infamous Whitechapel murders, was split into 20 divisions, with each group having to police a different area. And those policing this area struggled with overcrowding, dark, unlit alleyways, and busy lodging houses, with violence breaking out everywhere because of alcohol and gangs.
There used to be 45 gin houses and pubs in Whitechapel, which was one on every street corner in Whitechapel in the 1800s. The 10 Bells just behind me is quite famous because Jack the Ripper's last victim was last seen leaving that pub before she was found dead on the opposite side of the road the next morning.
Another famous pub in Whitechapel is this one, the Blind Beggar, famous because of Ronnie Cray, who in 1966 walked right in there and shot someone in front of a full pub.
But back to the Victorian era, Spitalfield Market was once known as the worst street in London. Known in the 1880s as Datchet Street, then Dorset Street, it was a place with lots of common lodge housing, and 2 slum landlords ran it who were involved in lots of illegal things. And Frederick Arthur Mackenzie of the Daily Mail said of Dorset Street, "It has recently sprung into undesired notoriety. Here we have a place which boasts of an attempt at murder on average once a month, of a murder in every house, and one house at least a murder in every room. Policemen go down it as a rule in pairs, hunger walks prowling in its alleyways, and the criminals of tomorrow are being bred there today." The lodging houses of Dorset Street and of the district around are the head centres of the shifting criminal population of London. Of course, the aristocrats of crime, the forager, the counterfeiter and the like, do not come here. In Dorset Street, we find more largely the common thief, the pickpocket, the area meek, the man who robs with violence, and the unconvicted murderer. The police have a theory. It seems that it is better to let these people congregate together in one mass where they can easily be found than to scatter them abroad. And Dorset Street certainly serves the purpose of a police trap.
So if you're looking for a criminal tour of London, I would just go to the East End, or at least the historical East End.
Thank you for coming with us to some criminal locations in London. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to get your grown-up to head over to thelittlehistoriansmagazine.com and subscribe to get our latest crime and punishment edition. And if you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up to date with all our latest releases. We'll see you next time.